Recovery and Renewal Leadership Foundational Module number 4. This is our fourth in a series of different modules. And today we're going to be focusing on the 4 R's and the 5 C's of psychosocial supports for students during pandemic response. So over the next hour and a half, we're going to be exploring the different things to consider, resources and some tools that'll help you implement these ideas into your work with students and each other during the pandemic. One of the purposes of the SCRR project is to, essentially our purpose is to provide supports for educators, school staff, and school-based clinicians to effectively implement trauma-informed crisis response, recovery, and renewal strategies into the systems that they're a part of. And so we also wanted to emphasize that we are a collaboration that is a part of, well, we've had the pleasure of being able to partner with SAMHSA. And so we wanted to acknowledge that the views that we're sharing in this webinar are ours and ours alone, and don't necessarily reflect the views and opinions or the policies of SAMHSA. And so we did want to give a little heads up, a little shout out to today's team. Those of us who are going to be sharing today are Livia, who just did our walkthrough, and welcomed everyone. Myself and my co-facilitator, Jen Leland, who's the field director with the School Crisis Recovery and Renewal project. So this is our agenda for today. We're going to be first doing a welcome and introduction, which we just began. Then we're going to spend some time to review and recap on school crisis recovery renewal. Then we're gonna spend some time focusing on understanding stress and trauma, which is going to be more of an introduction for those folks who are relatively new to these ideas. We're going to spend some time exploring the 4 R's of recovery and renewal and how it applies to COVID-19 during the pandemic. And then we're going to move into exploration about the 5 C's on different ways to respond during, really to attend to the renewal portion of trauma-informed practices around engaging with youth and older students. And then we're going to wrap it up by closing, doing our thank you, and talking a bit about more of the other opportunities that are here for you, explore different ways that we can support you. Our objectives for today are going to be focusing on these 3 that are listed right here. This training, or rather this webinar, will be largely didactic overview of the different phases of like contextualizing the phases of the pandemic and the psychosocial supports in each that will focus on specific things that you can do to respond in this phase. So first we want to understand the phases of the pandemic and crisis response, the 4 R's, and then we're going to help you understand the 5 C's, or ways to respond, and integrate some of the understanding of neurobiology and how stress impacts folks, and how it can be, how co-regulation can be used as a tool to help combat the effects of stress and trauma. So now my co-facilitator is actually going to lead us through an activity to just welcome everyone to the room to get grounded and settled in.
Thank you, Darren. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Jen Leland, her School Crisis Recovery and Renewal Field Director, and excited to be with you all today on this webinar, and know that it's a lot going on. There's a lot going on that we're attending to, that is tending to us, that is tenderizing us. And we're going to be spending a bulk of time talking about it. So stress, toxic stress, trauma, collective trauma, healing and recovery, but just a moment to sort of land or drop in. This is a self-holding micro practice. And so some of you may have experienced this before or done this before. It's a very, I love this practice because it combines 2 concepts and strategies we'll be talking about in this webinar. One is self-regulation, and the other is co-regulation. In this instance, we're sort of co-regulating ourselves, or self-soothing. And so I know Darren will talk a little bit about the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems later on. And this is a great way to either self or co-regulate all yourselves back into our parasympathetic nervous system as a way to sort of mitigate and tend to the many layers of stress that can be impacting us at any point, and especially during these days of pandemics, multiple pandemics. So just taking a moment to land wherever you are. If that's a chair, to kind of feel your butt in the chair, your back against the chair, something holding you. Maybe checking in with yourself, noticing your breath. Is it shallow? Is it deep? Is it rapid? Checking in on any messages your body is giving you. Just sending some breath down into the body. And then if you'd like to follow along with me, the first step is just to take both hands and gently put them onto the back of your head and see if you can allow your head to kind of rest into your hands. If you can allow yourself to kind of trust that your hands can carry the weight of your head. And then taking your left arm around, keeping your right arm holding the back of your head, taking the left hand and just putting it gently on your forehead. And again, holding your head up and feeling the sensation of being held. And then with your right arm or your other arm that's holding the back of your head, whichever arm you used, taking that arm, releasing it, keeping the hand on the forehead, taking the other arm and just settling it on your heart. Taking a breath. And then with the hand on your forehead, releasing that hand from your forehead, bringing it down, putting it on your belly. The gut area. Maybe taking a breath here and expanding the belly. So feeling your hand move from the belly expansion. Keeping your hand on the belly, taking your hand from your heart and bringing it back up behind your head, releasing the head, the weight of the head down. Taking a final breath here. Bringing the hand from the belly up to where we began. And just giving your head a little squeeze. I'm just ad-libbing now. Giving your head a little squeeze. Maybe scratching the head if that feels good. And then if you can, maybe shake out the arms as they get released. Just shake it out. I'm going to talk a lot about discharging stress, that it doesn't have to be all the time kind of meditation, that it can be also playful and joyful. You can do micro dances, dance parties with just one inside your office studio or classroom studio or closet, wherever this may find you today. So these are all ways to self-hold, to tend to self, to tend to stress arousal in the body. So thank you for doing that with me. And I'm just going to look at the chats. Yes, thank you. Micro dance parties, exactly. We're going to talk a lot about micro practices just because, I know that there's a lot of educators on the webinar today, and sometimes we don't have time for 20-minute meditations, right? Or we're working with younger students who really kind of teach me a lot about how to discharge stress in the body through play and stretch and dance and activity, that can be just as effective as sort of settling down in a more calming or regulating activity. I just want to welcome everyone again and encourage you to introduce yourself into the chat, where you're zooming in from today, and any particular needs you're bringing, what brings you to this particular webinar, besides your love of micro dance parties and self-holding exercises. All of that is welcome. Just introducing yourself to this community, where you're from. Thank you, Kurt from Santa Clara. Thank you for being here. Yes, Foster Youth Services Manager. Nicole, thank you, from Minnesota. We got Ventura County on the line. Need to play and smile. Thank you, Andy. We all do. That is a trauma-informed strategy. Play, joy, and smiling. New Orleans in the house. Thank you. Is that Robin? Wit, Pomo Wapo, and Coast Miwok lands. Thank you. Deep commitment to community care and building a better world. Thank you for future generations. And thank you, Mala. Hope I'm saying your name correctly, from Las Vegas. And Wendy, smart team. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being with us. We are going to spend some time together today. Darryn and I walking you through some material that we hope you find useful, and then we will put some resources out there as well to follow up on. I'm also going to give a shout out to Chandra Ghosh Ipen, who is a teacher and friend and colleague of mine, who's given me permission to share out her materials today, and also has some lovely, lovely materials for talking with especially younger kids about COVID-19 and the pandemic. So we'll be going through some of those materials, and she offers them free of charge. And so when we get to that, I will give a shout out to her again and tell you where you can find those materials, especially if you're working with younger kiddos and students, or if you have young kids at home as well. So just some acknowledgments. We acknowledge that we are facing a multitude of stressors, right? That COVID-19 almost sometimes is the backdrop of the many, many stressors or pandemics we are currently in. There's the COVID-19, racial uprisings, economic stressors, collapses, political upheaval, loss of school communities and connections, and then for many, many people, kind of an uptick in grief and loss. That we acknowledge that we are holding a multitude of feelings, responsibilities, fears, joys, sometimes all at the same time, that all of these many responses to stress and uncertainty, all of them are valid. We see them, we affirm all of them. And we acknowledge the critical need for reflection, inquiry, and prioritization of those most critical needs. And that there's no better opportunity to practice compassion and collective care than right now. This is the work. And we honor all of you for making time for this collective work and attention today. And we want to invite you to do what you need to do on this webinar. If you need to do a micro dance in the background, go for it. If you have little ones to tend to, if you have other needs to tend to, bio needs, we're going to be doing a lot of talking. This will be recorded and sent out, so you won't miss anything. But again, just inviting you to deeply tend to what your needs are while we are talking about how to tend to needs of students and others. And I'm going to turn this back over to my esteemed colleague, Darryn.
Thank you, Jen. So for the next few slides, what we're going to do is spend some time reviewing some of the relevant information about stress and trauma and how it ties into our presentation around the four R's and 5 C's. This information is pulled from the Trauma Informed Systems 101 training, which helps provide folks who are working toward changing their system to become more trauma informed, to move from being trauma inducing to being more of a healing system, not just for the clients, for the folks that they serve, but also for the people within the system. Before we jump into the content, though, we did want to just acknowledge the understanding that we are all in this global pandemic together. A good metaphor that we wanted to lift up was the idea that we're in the same storm, but in very different boats. And what this does is sort of speaks to how, though many of us, though we're all in the same similar situation, we may have different access to resources, tools, and even being impacted by a world health crisis in very different ways. And so we understand that we may be going through a similar experience, but experiencing it very different. And so compassion and understanding and curiosity is a really helpful ways to um, be able to connect with folks who may be struggling in different ways. So this is not about judgment. It's more about acknowledging the differences that we may all be experiencing. We recognize that stress and trauma is a public health issue that impacts us all, especially our school system. This is Stress is actually linked to the six leading causes of death, and trauma, which many of us are experiencing now, impacts more than just the individual who's experiencing it. It also has a ripple effect on the many folks that we're connected to, our colleagues, our friends, our families, and even in those folks that we pass and we may interact with very minimally in passing. We also understand that many communities are actually disproportionately affected by trauma and stress. And this sort of speaks to the intersection of oppression and poverty and trauma, which creates more of a toxic brew for folks. Trauma also can be transmitted intergenerationally, which the science of epigenetics really speaks to. And so we understand that this is a systemic issue where all folks in the system are impacted. And so systemic preventative approaches really is what's needed in order for us to be able to address the impact of stress and trauma on ourselves and our communities. Also acknowledging that COVID-19 is not only a traumatic event for those who may be experiencing the loss of loved ones and or maybe even struggling with the virus themselves, but also just the stress of thinking about and being mindful of the risk factors that are going on. So this is a huge call to action, really, which requires us to lead differently, to work differently, to think differently, and more specifically, to act differently when it comes to how we address each other. We also recognize that this change in the normal way of doing things can also be a stressor and can call us into action. And so, like, our workforce really does need safe spaces where folks, especially those in leadership, are able to just acknowledge and be honest about the impacts of this crisis on each of us. So we'll be experimenting and building this today as we move forward. So this slide here is called the Yerkes Dobson Law, and what it does is really highlights the impact of stress on our performance. And so on the x-axis, we see stress ranging from low to high, and on the y-axis, we see our performance. We know that stress isn't all bad. Sometimes stress can be a really helpful tool to help us get activated and get going and get moving. And so, like, typically, like, if you start your day, a little stress is good. You recognizing that you might need to get up and get going, get that first cup of coffee in you. Stress helps you become more alert. And at some point in our day, when we reach that optimal zone where the stress is stimulating us to be operating in our flow. And this is where we're most productive. Though sometimes that stress could be a little overwhelming, which would tip us closer to anxiety. Let's say, for example, you're having your work day, and all of a sudden you hear that you have a unexpected deadline land on your plate. Or let's say there's an urgent family meeting that's required your immediate attention. This could throw off your entire flow for the day and reach you closer to anxiety. And if the stress continues to increase, this could lead to disorganization and dysregulation. We just invite each of you to think about this. Like when you're interacting with your students, or when you're interacting with families, or even each other, where do you tend to spend most of your day? You can go ahead and drop some of your ideas in the chat. We know that stress can be experienced either as a challenge or a threat, which sort of goes into our next slide. Many of the folks that we're interacting with, not just our children and our young people, but also each other, sometimes might experience moments as a challenge or a threat. So a challenge is not a bad thing. Challenges actually can help us grow. They help us strengthen our skills, and even help us recognize where some of those strengths are that we possess. And one way to look at a challenge is when your perceived stressors is actually met by the perceived resources. So that's when, let's say, for example, for those of us who who actually usually take the bus to work, let's say you start off your day and you're on your way to work and you see that bus barreling down the street. If you had a good meal and you feel well rested, you might have the energy to go ahead and sprint to that bus stop to catch it just in time. So that's an example of a challenge. But let's say, for example, you didn't have a good night's sleep and you're exhausted, or you didn't have enough to eat, so you're lacking energy and you're sort of dragging your way to that bus stop. Once you see that bus coming down the road, you might experience that as a threat, because you don't perceive that you have the energy or the resources to actually reach that goal, which is to catch that bus before it barrels down the street. And so that's just one example of ways that you may experience a challenge versus a threat. And the key point here is that the thing that makes a challenge be felt as a threat is the perception of your resources. So right now in this pandemic, for example, thinking about the different boats in the same storm, if you have a large boat, if your boat's well resourced, then you might experience this pandemic more as a challenge, where you feel like your needs are being met, that you're able to focus on other things, like maybe even supporting others. But if you have an under-resourced boat, a boat that's sinking, or already being battered around by the wind, by our normal environment, then you may experience this pandemic as a huge threat, risking losing a job if you don't have a savings account, or risking being able to um, cope with some of the concerns of maybe a loss of a partner, or some of the grief of, or maybe even concern for your children. These things can be experienced as a threat if you're under-resourced. We mentioned a lot in our TOS 101 trainings about neurobiology and how we all share the same underlying neurobiology. And so this diagram right here is a simplified version of our body's stress reaction, like what happens to us when we're stressed. So this is an example of our autonomic nervous system. On the left side, we have our sympathetic nervous system, which is our activator. Oftentimes when we're stressed, it'll activate our fight, flight, or freeze response. And so what happens physiologically is our body gets ready to respond. And so that will increase our breath rate. Our heart starts to pump blood through our bodies faster. It sort of shuts down our guts activity so that we can have the energy we need to react. It's our accelerator. Our parasympathetic nervous system is the brakes. It's the thing that calms us down and slows us down. And so what happens is your heart rate starts to slow down, your gut becomes active again, and you're able to start digesting, the breakfast that you may have eaten. So thinking about the metaphor of the bus again, when you see that bus, your sympathetic nervous system activates, and then you get that energy to sprint toward that bus. And then once you climb on the bus, you sit down, you get into a centered space, your parasympathetic kicks in, your parasympathetic nervous system kicks in and starts to calm you down. And then you can rest and digest.
Yeah, thank you, Darryn. Again, going back to these key concepts that Darryn highlighted, I'm just going to throw some questions out there. COVID-19, is it thinking about your students, thinking about yourselves? How are we experiencing it? Are we experiencing it as a challenge? Are we experiencing it more on the threat level? And going back to this slide here, just thinking about the perceived stressors, sometimes we get over-focused on, right? How do we decrease the stressors? How do we fix? How do we get rid of stressors? And this slide really offers us the opportunity to look at the resources. We can't change, we can't control the global pandemic, but we can maybe have some influence over our perceived resources or real resources. And also just thinking about, where do your students live? How might they be experiencing it? Where does your classroom live? You know, is your classroom or office work environment generally kind of in that sympathetic zone, threat zone, hyper arousal, kind of go, 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 hyper alert all the time? Or is your classroom or office work environment or home life generally in kind of the flow zone with some challenges that you can then meet and get back into flow zone? So just thinking about this, and again, thinking about if our stressors are continuously and relentlessly increasing, right? If we're just up against it day in and day out, every hour of the day, something new is coming at us, which feels like I heard somebody say the other day, like 2020 will be an adjective, one day, right? Oh, woof, that sounds 2020. Right. So what does that mean? So that kind of dumpster fire image. So if we are up against it and the stressors are relentless and we are always in the sympathetic nervous system, stress hormones are being released, cortisol is being released, and overabundance of cortisol. And so just thinking about, and we'll get into this a little bit later around the pandemic phases, about what happens when we have that cortisol crash and how does that impact our resources, including our sleep. So again, just understanding this is a basic neurobiology, like 5-second brief section. But we did want to introduce this to you because we were going to be spending a lot of time talking about what we can do to resource ourselves and our students to mitigate this stress response, to really spend as much time as possible getting back into our parasympathetic nervous systems as much as we can, and using both self and co-regulation strategies to do that. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about collective trauma and recovery. I like this definition. It's by Dr. Hirschberg, and I can't remember his first name. I will try to remember this and put it into the chat. Collective trauma is a cataclysmic event that shatters the fabric of society. So when we're talking about kind of the stress trauma continuum, right? There's positive stress, there's kind of toxic stress, dysregulating stress, too much time in the sympathetic nervous system stress, and then it can tip over into trauma. And trauma can have long-lasting adverse effects on our bodies, on our biosocial, relational, spiritual realms. And collective trauma is something experienced all together that shatters the relational networks, not just internally for the individual, but for the collective, for the community, for the fabric of society. And so when we think about collective trauma, we're thinking about different phases, and I'm going to go into some pandemic phases, but just thinking about, where are we right now with the pandemic? The first phase is just experiencing it and surviving it. Experiencing it and surviving it. So this is with individual level trauma and also collective trauma. And then there's this move or this shift that can happen eventually into memory making. And I would put out there that we haven't yet made our collective memories about COVID-19. We might be in the process, but still very much experiencing and in survival mode. And then moving into recovery and renewal is about collective meaning making from the memory making. So trauma, we often say in trauma-informed care or trauma theory, what is shareable is bearable, but that usually comes after we've been able to get through it. So that memory making that leads to meaning making, and that collective meaning making is what can then lead to renewal and what we call post-traumatic growth. So that we, this really about, remaking the scaffolding of our identities, that we come through sometimes trauma and collective traumas, and those wounds of trauma even more whole and integrated than we may have been before. That's what's referred to as post-traumatic growth or renewal, transformation, healing. And so just putting this slide out there, if it's helpful for folks, that we are very much, and people want to put this in the chat. Yes, 2020 year of adversity and growth. Yes, for sure. And then somebody else put collective loss, which we'll talk about as well. So going into the 4 R's, this looks all neat on the slide. Look at this nice little graphic with different circles. I'm going to use this. Some people really find it helpful. There's a phrase that goes around, what is predictable is preventable. So I think that there's some stress mitigation that can happen when we're able to predict or at least put words to different phases. So I'm going to offer this up to you, the 4 R's. This actually comes out of SCRR's work, and also University of Michigan did a global pandemic psychosocial supports during the readiness, response, and recovery phase. So I will try to put that in the chat, that resource in the chat later on as well. It's also on our website that we'll be referring to in the resources. So readiness for the pandemic, we're going to really apply this to the pandemic. Ongoing readiness is always ongoing, right? We are readying ourselves for the next pandemic as we go through this pandemic. Response includes kind of the pandemic onset. It includes the surge. It includes pre-vaccine, vaccine dissemination. It includes tipping points and crises. So tipping points we'll get into in a couple slides. The recovery phase. So that is about coming back together again in a pandemic, reestablishing some routines. They might not be the new normal, but reestablishing some routines. In this case, maybe coming back together again, being in community together. It can mean mourning together, celebrating together. Renewal, that post-traumatic growth that I talked about, meaning making, collective meaning making, and an opportunity for not only individual growth and transformation, but what did we learn about our systems? Not just our internal parasympathetic and sympathetic systems, but our external school systems, classroom systems, and structures. And how might those grow too out of this adversity? So I'm going to go through some of these pretty quickly. I want to say again that these are not linear, and that you may be, but they can be a helpful strategy and tool to think about, right? So somebody might be in readiness, more in readiness or in response, and another student that you're working with may be in renewal. They may be ready to pivot into curiosity and meaning making and memory making. You as an educator might still be in response, hyper alert. So it's just another kind of way to think about where you might be, where somebody else might be. And we're going to talk about some psychosocial supports in each. So the readiness is really, the psychosocial supports are about preparation. What is predictable is preventable. So to the extent that we can prepare and say, hey, what would happen, just like we do drills in schools, what would happen if we come against another global pandemic? How might we prepare differently this time, going through and learning what we have learned so far? So identifying upfront educational tools regarding signs of distress, trauma-informed trainings are always helpful. Sustaining community care networks and resiliency networks. A big thing that's come out of this pandemic is mutual aid networks that hopefully we can sustain even post-Rona, post-Miss Rona, post-pandemic, so that we can tap into those and sustain those as part of our collective care. So this is readiness. Now I'm going to spend a little bit of time up here. So I want everyone to kind of think back to March and maybe how you showed up in the beginning of the pandemic onset, what we call pandemic onset. So that is, we began with a few people contracting the virus, then more people contracted the virus. Then maybe you heard about, you were following, if you were like me, you were following the Johns Hopkins sort of obsessively, maybe a little bit too much obsessively, like following all the different countries and the rates. So how did you show up? So in that moment, I showed up with a lot of adrenaline. And I would suspect if we have a lot of educators on the line, that I'm not alone, that we are kind of folks that want to show up and take care of it. Like, let's show up and do this. Let's show up and take care of it. What can I do? How can I show up? How can I make this work, right? And when March happened, at least in San Francisco Unified School District out here on the West Coast, oh my, I was hearing from so many educators. They were up until midnight putting together take-home packets. They were working 14, 16-hour days. Their adrenaline was rocking, even with their anxiety. And what I knew would happen is what we call the adrenal crash or the adrenal fatigue. So again, that sympathetic nervous system gets activated. We can go into what is sometimes called hero mode or adrenaline mode, and we can get a lot done, and we can show up and be very impactful. And that cortisol that gets released can then interfere with our sleep, our digestion. If we can't spend any time in our parasympathetic nervous systems, and can lead to adrenal fatigue. So thinking back to March, how did you show up in the pandemic onset? There are various surges that happened across the country, so not sure where everyone is. Right now we're having our surge in California. So what happens when there's a surge? How does that impact our stress levels? And then tipping points. Tipping points can be racial uprisings, right? What happened at the Capitol? So all of these tipping points can be events that either decrease or increase fear and other risk behaviors related to the pandemic. So again, how are you showing up in these increased stressor environments, and how might your students be showing up? Might there be a parallel process between your anxiety and adrenaline and theirs as well? And we are also in a serious climate crisis. Yes, so many pandemics, climate crisis, racial uprisings, COVID-19, you name it, white mob violence. There's a lot going on. There's a lot going on. And so again, this is knowledge, right? When we say trauma informed, trauma informs everything. So we're going to be trauma informed, but trauma informed means being really kind of noticing how you show up in a stress inducing environment, and understanding that if we show up with a lot of adrenaline and go into that kind of hero mode, that we might be around the corner from that adrenal fatigue or crash. And so just predicting that. And the way to mitigate that for yourself or for your students, again, we're going to talk about the psychosocial supports, but again, it's anything that can tip us back into that parasympathetic nervous system that can sort of allow us to catch our breath, to feel held, to feel affirmed, to slow down, to rest, to recalibrate. Here are some school and system-wide supports related to pandemic onset or surges or the response phase. And again, just keeping in mind that associated with this pandemic, as with many other pandemics, the school system thinking about communication structures, right-sizing information, because just like students, we as educators or social workers or staff in the school ecosystem, when we are in high stress arousal and responding to so many different stressors, we can only take in so much information, right? Not the time to have a 3-page memo. So right-sizing information, multimodal information, giving a little bit of extra time to process the information, having formal and informal mutual aid and community support networks, and then attending to stigma and discrimination, right? Pandemics reveal and exacerbate stigmas. We've seen that happen, particularly the Asian American communities around COVID-19. So counteracting racism, counteracting stigma, again, school system approaches to sort of mitigate the stress that both students and educators are going to be impacted by. And then anticipating grief and loss. So planning for anticipating responses to grief, loss, and death, and pulling in and weaving together cultural and religious, spiritual, and faith-based supports. And so we see that happening now. Again, these are system level responses. And then we will also talk about individual strategies. The recovery period, the pandemic recovery period. So that is when we begin to come back together again safely. So in a school context, it's bringing school communities together again, and then beginning to do that memory making. So it really is post kind of experience and survival zone and into that. Remember when we were going through that? Remember when we were distance learning? Remember in March, right? So beginning that memorializing, meaning making, giving words, giving language, sharing our experiences about what we just went through. The pandemic recovery period is also marked by more deeply focused grief and bereavement. Beginning to meaning make, not just in your own kind of space, but with others, social cohesion. So ways in which schools can come together, classroom activities can be centered on meaning making, and using partnerships. Lots of creative partnerships. I just have been in, I think I've been in 4 Zoom memorials since last year. And so not the same, definitely acknowledging the loss of the way in which we used to mourn together, but also appreciating the creativity that went into those Zoom memorials to allow us the virtual space to be able to come together and mourn collectively. And so a special note about grief, loss, and I put here rage. We talk a lot about, especially when we're talking about racial trauma, but when we talk about collective grief and collective trauma, whether that's the pandemic or 9/11 or crisis climate or fires, natural disasters, school shootings, community violence, police brutality, grief, I always want to make a note, grief can show up sometimes as rage. That can show up in students. It can look like disciplinary or behavioral needs, anger, frustration, what I like to call righteous or sacred rage. So again, just understanding that grief can look very different based on the developmental, based on the boat people are riding it out in. And so again, understanding and just marking this somewhere inside yourself that sometimes grief and loss shows up as rage. And again, bringing tenderness to that, regulating before we are connecting, before we're regulating. And so again, specific supports, attending to grief, the tenderness of grief, community loss, absent connection, developing modified options for cultural, racial, religious, spiritual, faith-based supports for grieving, and making sure to have tiered level of supports, check-ins, debriefing, short and long-term traumatic grief counseling. And again, knowing that your students also may be experiencing rage either within themselves as a way to grieve, but also within the family. I think up against enough stressors, we often see a higher incidence of conflicts with people whom we deeply love. And yet our fuse is a little bit shorter, and that can show up in higher rates of family conflict. And then the pandemic renewal phase is that post-traumatic growth, that renewal, that reimagining systems and services, that growing, evolving new possibilities can look like greater appreciation, hopefully, for our school communities and our educators, can look like shared fates and collectivism. So lots of possibilities there. And I'm going to take a moment to invite us to do discharge stress micro exercise, otherwise known as stretching. So again, stretching. If you can join me while we transition, just taking both of your arms and putting them as far back as possible. And then even going a little bit farther. Don't hurt yourself. Going a little bit farther. Almost like extending your arms, like elongating your arms. And then bringing your arms up and stretching up. And then this is a great one for students. Just shake it out with the sound. Shake it out with the sound. Again, discharging the stress. Anything we can do to discharge the stress and get us back into our parasympathetic nervous system. So it can be micro. You can go for a run. I saw somebody who says they like to go for a run, or that helps mitigate the stress. You can go for a run and stretching, dancing, micro dancing, any way you can discharge from your body, right? Movement, metabolize it. And I'm going to hand this over to Darryn.
Thank you, Jen. The next section we're going to be focusing on are the 5 C's to responding to a crisis. And we're going to be emphasizing some of the psychosocial supports that you can use for students in each of these different responses. The first one we start with is connection. Connection is all about where it's primarily about increasing the sense of safety and stability for folks. And so we recognize that connection is central to healing. We heal through relationships. It helps provide predictability and structure for young people and for each other. And it's all about being in community with folks. One of the things that you could do to increase some of that safety and stability is to speak about and normalize our stress reactions. And in conversations, in the way that you message your communication with folks, to emphasize the hope, our individual and collective resiliency, and some of the natural supports that we have to kind of speak to recovery. Additionally, you can create different safe spaces, like using ritual and collective grief, like Jen mentioned before, some of the ways that we've been doing that creatively and virtually. And thinking about with teens, and also acknowledging one of the things that Jen lifted up about how when we're in stress, in moments of high stress, we tend to go back to our cultural center, and a lot of those implicit biases and stereotypical thinking tends to happen. So another way that you could address that connection, knowing that this is possible, is to speak about cultural diversity. Maybe even invite different ways that you can explore how different folks in your classroom might respond differently, do different rituals in order to help grieve and build more connection. One of the reasons why connection is so important is sort of emphasized by this next slide here. So as you look at these images, what do you want to do? What does this impact? What is your initial response? And feel free to drop it in the chat. I know for me, my initial impulse is to try to console, to maybe grab or gently rock the baby or pat them or use my voice and to hum to try to soothe them. So this is essentially all about co-regulation. Our babies are really dependent upon grown-ups in order to survive. And this includes helping them to regulate their stress arousal. So when they get activated, to learn how to self-soothe themselves by using the parents or the adults' soothing techniques to calm back down. So we're actually hardwired to respond to babies. And that co-regulation is really key because it helps babies who are learning to co-regulate help calm themselves down. So in a healthy situation, during co-regulation, the caregiver uses touch and movement and voice and breath in order to help the baby calm back down. And this activates their neurobiology, so that parasympathetic nervous system again. Because the neurons that fire together wire together with repeated co-regulation, the baby's ability to calm down becomes, after they're activated or distressed, becomes more easy to do. They learn how to do that. It comes more strongly wired up. But co-regulation doesn't stop when we're babies. It continues. The need for it continues as we grow. And even adults, for those of us who work with people like you all, it's part of our job when we're working in teams, when we're collaborating with folks, and when we're serving folks, to actually provide co-regulation for folks, especially when they're stressed out. And we know that teens and dealing with a lot of the emotions and the natural developmental stage where their social supports become more important than their family sometimes. That's really important that we give them time and space to connect in order to co-regulate each other. And so I'm sure you can think about different ways that you could do that in a classroom or in a community meeting or group. So the next one we're focusing on is context. So context is primarily about reducing stress, or at least that's the main goal. And we do this by helping address some of that uncertainty, to respond to folks with tenderness, and to clarify some of the natural tensions that are coming up by being in this experience together. And so it's about acknowledging the context we're in and gently inviting folks into the space or into self-care and recognizing that. One of the things they recommend doing is affirming and naming and normalize some of the experiences that we're all having. And one of the things that we are definitely discouraging is to avoid, or rather encourage folks to avoid the business as usual, to spend some time, even if it's a short amount of time, to address the issue around us, rather than jumping right into education or whatever the task is at hand. And to spend some time to normalize some of the stress reactions and emphasize hope and resiliency so that folks can begin to get settled and grounded. And so one of the tools that we're offering is actually was mentioned by Jen earlier, which we'll have her speak more about. But this image here is from that resource.
Shout out to Chandra Ghosh Ipen again, who is at the Child Trauma Institute in San Francisco. And on her one of her side gigs, I don't know how she has time, but is to do this children's illustration, and it's called piploproductions.com. And one of the things I most appreciate about Chandra is she offers all of this open source, open collaboration. You can go to the website, download the book. It's a coloring book. So this can be a great tool to use with younger children. And these images are pulled from Trinka and Sam in The Big Virus, Fight the Big Virus. So it's in child language. It's in 7 different, translated into 7 different languages. And so this can be relative to connection and context, which Darryn just spoke about, a tool for both of those, because you're both connecting with somebody while you are naming, affirming, and kind of normalizing the abnormal, right? Or at least acknowledging that we are going through something together. So this can be used, I know we've used it at our therapeutic preschool in circle time. So just strongly encourage folks with younger students and younger children or younger kiddos at home to check this out. So again, you're looking at it through the characters. With older students, there are apps and other resources on Piplo Productions. But we're looking at school-related stress. So, again, just naming it, not needing to process it, not needing to dive into it unless it's something they want to speak more about, but just naming, hey, here are some things that might be sources of stress. And so these are some of the Of course, it's not called sources of stress in the book, but here are some ways in which you can begin to name, affirm, and normalize both sources of stress and resources through this Trinket and Sam and the big virus. And then I would say for older students, even in the distance learning environment, we are doing lots of meme therapy, what I'm calling meme therapy, right? So sometimes the older students are oftentimes giving me how they're communicating how they are feeling or what's coming up for them through memes. And so there's all sorts of resources that, again, we'll point out to you, and also at our Trauma Transform website for more specific developmental resources that are similar to this Piplo Productions resource, but are for kind of older students or middle school students. And so again, doing this in connection, being able to name it, being able to verbalize. And again, this is related to the big virus or to COVID, but all the many layers of stress that can come up for students in their own families, in their communities, and I would also say, and for us, that this is what could come up. So just allowing people to be able to share it. And so again, thinking about what is shareable is bearable. So this next C is coherence. And we're getting into, is it possible, Livia, if you could put some of the resources, the Piplo Productions, into the chat, that would be great. Yes, thank you. Thank you. And maybe our Trauma Transform Mass Trauma resource page as well. I'm referencing a lot of resources there. So we will also send it out in the follow-up email as well. So this next one is coherence. And this is, again, back to connectedness. We're going to overemphasize connectedness because as we think about self and co-regulation, I just heard a podcast last week that was talking about pandemic stress responses, and that younger folks are really needing more co-regulation, but actually older folks are more able and needing more self-regulation, more time alone. I don't know how true that is, but that is coming out of a research project that's going on that was discussed in the podcast. So again, thinking about what is needed here. Is what's needed here more self-regulation, self-soothing activities, or is what's needed here co-regulation, collective healing? So again, connectedness can be connectedness with self, with cosmos, with each other, right? So co-regulation is about connectedness. And through co-regulation, through collective memory making and meaning making, we begin to move from chaos to coherence. And that's really the task here with students of all ages and with ourselves, is how do we pivot from this hyper arousal, uncertainty, relentless stressors into what are we going through? How do we make sense of what we're going through? How do we make collective memory about what we're going through so that we can then move into meaning making and have it move just a little bit from chaos to coherence? And so sometimes, when you're with students, I'm just going to give some practical examples here. Sometimes with students, you may be talking to them on the screens or in the live environments in the classrooms, and you may notice that some students have rapid speech and who are really talking really, really fast. So I want to talk to you, Miss Leland, about this and this, and I want to tell you this, and I can't do this, and lots of rapid speech. My colleagues can sometimes speak rapidly as well. I myself can speak rapidly. So one strategy here, very, very rapid speech can be indicative of some chaotic experience that's happening. And so what you don't want to do right? What sometimes happens with therapists especially is get into really try to slow people down by talking too slow, right? By inviting them into a state that feels really unreachable for somebody who's in a very hyper-aroused state. So one of the ways to shift folks from a chaotic environment to a more coherent environment is to meet them where they're at a little bit and then titrate it down just a little bit, right? So if a student's really talking really, really fast, I'm not going to talk super slow in response. I might increase the cadence of my speech, but just take it one level down from where they are and just notice, wow, you're talking really fast. See, there's a lot going on. I really want to understand what's happening for you. And I'm wondering if we can, go in this corner, or if we can talk after the Zoom session or the classroom session. I really want to understand what you're saying. So again, right-sized pivots. And again, about moving from chaotic, hyperarousal, fractured to coherence. And that can usually most efficiently and best be done in co-regulation, right? So that example I just gave was definitely a co-regulation example. It can also be done through just witness bearing. Just letting folks kind of talk about at their own rate what's on their mind. And usually what can happen through that witness bearing is that it begins to shift, right? And saying it out loud, we begin to do that meaning making and that memory making out loud with witness bearing in a way that can be very co-regulating. The next one is collaboration. So again, let me go back one more. So what to avoid here? So we have the 5 C's handout, which we'll also put a link to. It's on our Trauma Transform page. The 5 C's have the kind of do's and don'ts. Do's and don'ts. So the do's are that, co-regulation, what is shareable is bearable, and witness bearing. And the don'ts are the avoid doing is defining or meaning making for somebody else. Right? So again, walking that line of witness bearing, doing with folks, doing with students, resourcing, but not defining or interpreting or making meaning for them. And again, that goes into collaboration. So co-creating alliances and action. And this goes into action. So we talked about on the internal level, discharging the stress, like through micro-dancing, micro-dance parties, or stretching, or breathing, or meditation, or art. Sometimes we really need more active ways to metabolize stress and trauma. And so that can look many different ways. And for this slide, I'm going to talk about it in terms of agency. When we have agency, some form of agency, some form of ability to respond to stress, to mitigate it in our own way, that can decrease, the lasting adverse effects of stress in our bodies. So wherever we can create some sort of agency, some sort of choice and voice in these strategies. Would you like to talk to me afterwards, or would you just like to sit with me and know that I'm here with you? Allowing people some options. Are you would you like to focus on math right away, or would you like to give it a minute and then I'll come back to you? So any kind of choice and voice, any kind of agency that folks can bring can help mitigate the effects of stress and arousal on the body. And on a larger level, that can be any sort of advocacy, any sort of leadership roles that students can step into. And in fact, our SCRR team is hoping for student leaders to improve some of these 5 C's. So if you're working with students who would like to receive a stipend to help us develop this curriculum on this, what a great way to have agency and to be able to co-create, co-construct resources, strategies, and skills that are meaningful for them. And then again, doing with and not doing for, and avoiding what to avoid, what not to do, avoiding forcing coping skills and self-care, right? I know we don't like it when we have self-care or coping skills forced on us, and certainly students also have been vocal about that as well. So offering choices, co-creating, co-constructing kind of care plans, self-care, co-care plans. And some students are really going to want a lot of resources, and some students may be in a place where they can't even tell you what they need, right? I don't know what I need. I just need to not be here. In those instances, that's about chaos to coherence. And again, witness bearing, co-regulation, and not jumping into the strategy or action too quickly, but just being with. So we talk about kind of that moving, remember that Jerks Dobson scale, like when we're in our optimal zone, our flow zone, and then we're in our disorganized zone. How do we move from that anxiety disorganized back to flow zone? So if you think about that for yourself, it's probably not that different for students, right? So I just need somebody to, for me, I have accountability partners at work who can see when I'm stressed, who can see when I'm rapidly talking, and who can say to me, Jen, do you need like a moment outside in the sun and then returning to this environment? And again, back to what Darryn said earlier, we learn self-regulation. This is just such a great reminder. The crying baby. We learn self-regulation through co-regulation. Trauma can actually fracture co-regulation, our ability to accept support. So that's something to be mindful of, is that early trauma, especially, or complex trauma in relationships with caregivers or people we relied on for resources and support and protection. If there was trauma or stress that happened in that relationship, that may challenge the co-regulation strategies. So again, having both in your toolbox: self-regulation, self-soothing, self-care, and co-regulation, co-care, collective care. And then again, offering people voices and choices about which one might be more resourcing for them. And then here's from Piplo again, Trinka and Sam and the Big Virus. Here are just some things that help, that is lifted up in the book. And I am also inviting everyone into the chat to put your own, if you have some that you have also used successfully, creatively, tenderly with students of any age, of any developmental stage, you can put that in the chat too for our collective co-construction here. But things that help, and again, this is from Piplo Productions, and this is super good resource to do that doing with and not for with young kiddos, because you can ask them, what do you like to do, right? And they can point to the photo, to the images. So again, read storybook, story time, using art, using memes, being able to point to how you feel inside on images and graphics, being able to point to the resources that are most helpful for you or for your students, right? Being able to name and identify and choose, having voice and choice. So again, this is from Trinka and Sam and the Big Virus. This is a coloring book, so they can color while you are putting into practice the 5 C's. And then finally, consolidation. So as we move through kind of the co-regulation phases and the supporting students when they're in high stress arousal, as we pivot from chaos to coherence, we begin to move into kind of consolidation. So this would be kind of at the end of your session or support moment with students. that it's important to avoid leaving anyone in chaos and to kind of summarize or to connect to the stories that were lifted up of gratitude, of resilience, of hope, to laugh, to find the joy and the humor, the moving stories of their survival. So again, beginning to pull those threads in our conversation and supports and our relationships with students and with each other, and pulling those threads together as part of the move from kind of chaos and survival into memory and meaning making. And this can be done on an individual student level, and this can be done on a classroom level as well. And if any of you were part of our Mending Our Wounds Institute in January, we went over some strategies there that we'll have resources for as well that can be implemented in the classroom. And then finally, I want to take a moment. Here are the resources here. Thank you to all those who have been putting them into the chat. Super helpful. Maybe we can take a breath here and a stretch here. School Crisis Recovery and Renewal website there. Trinket and Sam, Fighting the Big Virus there. And then on our Trauma Transform website, we have the 5 C's, both for leadership and for clinical crisis supports. We went over the clinical crisis supports today. And so I know that we threw a lot of at you, that it was a lot of didactic material. So I just want to take a moment just to say that the 5 C's were put together to be very simple and easy and micro strategies that we can remember in the moment of our own stress arousal and sometimes alertness or anxiety or disorganization. So they're meant to be strategies that are particularly useful for the survival, for the response phase of the pandemic. And again, that pivot from survival and into, hopefully, collective recovery and renewal. I'd like to take a moment here just to, again, thinking back to the 4 R's and mentioning again that it's not linear, right? We can be in response phase and somebody else can be in renewal phase. So thinking back to that, if folks want to share in the chat, if you're able to share in the chat, where are you? Which phase do you find yourself most relating to or resonating with? Are you in response phase, surge phase? Are you in both response and recovery? Are you in kind of recovery, but your partner or your wife or your husband is in renewal? Right? So thinking about identifying which phase you might be in or which phases you might be straddling. Thank you, Nicole. Response and recovery. Yeah. And again, aren't we all kind of straddling both? Like, are we going back to school? Are we not going back to school? Is it safe to come back together and hug? Is it not safe? What does it mean about the vaccines? You know, who's getting a vaccine? So now there's a surge. So again, kind of straddling both response and recovery. Amy, I just moved back into response and it feels ugly in this moment. Yeah, that's right. That's real. Yeah, you know, a lot of folks are just acknowledging the exhaustion of being on the roller coaster. Maybe it's the response and recovery roller coaster that a lot of us are on. Confusion, hope mode. Yeah. Yep. So again, this was a quick overview and offering of both some neurobiology, very brief 101 kind of stress arousal, Yerkes Dodson, the relationship between our stress levels and our performance. And I would also invite us to remember student stress level and their performance, whether on the Zoom screens in the classrooms, in the virtual classrooms, or in the hybrid classrooms, or in the full return to classroom. And then the 4 R's, which can help us at least think about where we are and what's needed in each of those phases, or what might be most resourceful, right? If we are in response mode, I would highly encourage us to kind of think about the 5 C's, because those are strategies very rooted in co-regulation to be able to carve out more sacred time in our parasympathetic inner healing response mode. Yeah, PJ, thank you for sharing. You're not alone in that. And we're hearing from many, many schools the rise and uptick in both student suicide and educator suicide. So again, going back to that grief, collective ways of memorializing, naming, acknowledging. Again, sometimes grief can look like rage. Scratch the surface and we find a lot of tender grief. So there's some people who needed to jump off early. Thank you for those that are engaging in the chat. Thank you for your patience and grace while we threw a lot of information at you, but hopefully you can dig back into the resource links that we provided. Darryn, are there any final thoughts that you had to share before we wrap this up?
Just a reiteration of how important grace and empathy are in responding to folks during this time. To kind of like recognize the importance of having compassion for ourselves too, considering that we're all reacting, or we're all being impacted by this in different ways. So I just wanted to give a little nod to that for all our educators out there who are really providing an opportunity for our young people to begin the process of coping and healing from our, our crisis. Mm-hmm. Also wanted to give a little nod to, for those folks who wanted to engage a little deeper around what we've presented today, we're going to be having a coaching clinic next week in the same time frame. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to let folks know that there'll be another opportunity to collaborate and come up with other ways that we might be able to put these ideas into practice. Mm.
Yeah, and we did focus on the younger students today. Wendy, I see you in the chat. I will make sure that we have the resources for the older students as well. You can find a lot of resources on our website too, traumatransform.org. It's under construction, but you can still find a resource under Mass Trauma COVID-19. And again, we will get those resource links out to those folks who attended today. There is also a COVID crisis recovery and renewal coaching consulting communities. Wow, that's a mouthful. See, I just did what I encouraged everyone to avoid doing, which was too many words or right-sizing information. So don't do what I just did, but COVID crisis recovery coaching, lots more C's. So this is a cohort that we're offering in March. We have heard from so many people. We've heard from so many school communities about how absolutely overwhelmed you feel, how much like I talked about students not being able to name or even say what they need. Many of educators and leaders in schools are also saying that. I don't even know how to ask for TA. I'm so overwhelmed. I don't know what I need. I need it all. I need it all. So for those of you who are in that same boat, same storm, different boats, we are offering a community to come together for some lovely, tender, informative, and strategic TA around just being in this context together, being in the storm together, and going deeper into resourcing ourselves as leaders in this time, resourcing others, colleagues, other people we may supervise or co-regulate in our school communities, and then resourcing students and leading schools. So please, please, please sign up for that if that sounds good to you. It's a 4-part series. It'll be in March with Antoine Moore and Oriana Ides, and Antoine Moore is a leadership coach for Trauma Transformed, and Oriana is an educator and one of our field coaches for SCRR. So please join that. There's an interest form. Again, we'll send this out to you as well. But please sign up for that if that sounds good. Come together with other folks who are similarly not knowing how to deal with all of this, right? All of this, not even knowing what kind of TA they need, just needing it all. So join us as we sort of memory make and meaning make and engage in some very supported and resourced and facilitated collective care and strategies. Again, this is next week. If you want to deep dive into any of the 5 C's or the module from last week or any of the renewal modules, please join our coaching clinic. That's the time where we get to be more interactive and more moving from, knowledge change to application to practice in your context. And if you would like to request technical assistance, share resources, suggest topics for future trainings, please, 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 we welcome you. We encourage you to engage at schoolcrisishealing.org, where you will find lots of ways to plug in or to request more intensive TA for your school community. And lastly, we thank you so much for attending, for engaging with us with your time, with your parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems, and micro dancing and stretching and all the things. We thank you for your time and honor all the work that you're doing each and every day in these incredibly challenging contexts. You'll receive a feedback form. Please, please, please give us feedback. We do take feedback in and make changes based on feedback. We want to meet your needs and resource your needs as best as possible, and feedback helps us do that. And then finally, connect with us on the social medias, Facebook, IG, Twitter, and ways to plug in up there on the corner as well. And with that, I invite anybody still with us to put kind of one-word feeling into the chat. How are you leaving this webinar today? How are you leaving feeling? Again, one way to get into the parasympathetic nervous system is by, I'm just going to throw some fancy terminology, affect identification. Putting words to our internal states can help us sort of breathe, ground, calibrate. So resourced, reflective, want to learn more. Thank you for all the great information. Excited to learn more. Appreciation, connected. Thank you, everyone.